The dawn of the 14th of June, 1944, did not so much break as it seeped into the world, a slow and reluctant stain of grey light spreading across the scarred face of Normandy. This was not the clean, hopeful dawn of poetry. This was a dawn heavy with the residue of cataclysm. For 8 days, the largest amphibious invasion in human history had churned the French coastline into a grotesque landscape of mud, shattered steel, and broken bodies. The air itself was a permanent, foul cocktail of scents that would be seared into the memory of every man who breathed it. The salty tang of the Channel, the acrid bite of cordite from endless artillery duels, the thick, black smoke from burning vehicles and fuel dumps, and beneath it all, the sickly sweet, cloying odour of death, the smell of decaying flesh that no breeze could fully dispel. In the hedgerows, those ancient dense embankments that had become natural fortresses and death traps, movement was cautious and fearful. From these hiding places, they began to emerge, not the proud, victorious Wehrmacht of Nazi propaganda, but its shattered remnants. They were young men, boys really, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion, their eyes holding the hollow, 1,000-yard stare that is the universal signature of men who have seen too much. They were soldiers of the German 91st Air Landing Division, the 352nd Infantry Division, and a dozen other units now chewed to pieces in the Allied meat grinder. Their uniforms, the field grey wool that had once symbolized European military dominance, were now ragged, caked in a cement-like mixture of mud and dried blood, and hung loosely on frames gaunt from weeks of combat stress and inadequate rations. Their surrender was a slow, shuffling procession of the defeated. Their hands, raised above their heads, trembled. This tremor was a complex physical language. It spoke of a very rational fear, the fear of the unknown. The stories drilled into them of the barbaric Americans who took no prisoners, who executed captives out of hand, who tortured and mutilated. But the tremor also spoke of a deeper, physiological collapse. These were men who had been existing on the razor's edge of survival, their bodies consuming themselves from the inside out. The German frontline ration by mid-1944 was a testament to a nation and a war machine on the brink of starvation. It consists of a daily allotment of black, gritty bread, heavy with sawdust and potato flour to stretch the dwindling wheat supply, a thin, watery soup where a chunk of turnip or potato was a notable event, a smear of margarine or ersatz honey, and the ubiquitous ersatz coffee, a bitter, stomach-churning brew made from roasted barley, acorns, and chicory that provided warmth but no actual nutrition. They were, in the most literal sense, starving warriors, their energy reserves long depleted, their muscles wasting, their very bones becoming brittle. The American GIs who moved forward to secure them were a study in stark contrast. They were tired, certainly, their faces lined with the same strain of combat, their eyes shadowed by the same horrors. But they moved with a purpose and a physical solidity that the Germans immediately recognized. These were men whose caloric intake was measured in the thousands, men fueled by canned ham and eggs, vitamin-fortified biscuits, and real coffee. Their hands were steady as they performed the ritual of capture, the systematic pat-down, the confiscation of watches, knives, Lugers, and personal effects. A process that felt less like robbery and more like a symbolic stripping of identity. A final, humiliating confirmation of their new status as property of the United States War Department. But then, the first crack appeared in the monolithic facade of the monstrous enemy. American medics, their uniforms marked with red crosses, moved through the ragged lines of prisoners. They did not carry rifles. They carried canvas bags filled with bandages, sulfur powder, and morphine. They knelt in the churned-up earth, their actions brisk, professional, and devoid of malice. They cleaned shrapnel wounds with antiseptics that stung with the promise of healing, not infection. They applied clean, white gauze bandages, a shocking sight in a world of filth. And then, from the depths of those bags, they produced small, rectangular, olive-drab miracles, the American K-ration box. The sound of that waxed cardboard being opened was a new one in the symphony of war. Inside was a universe of plenty that defied all German comprehension. There was a small tin of meat, not the gelatinous, unidentifiable mass of their own Schlachtschüssel, but solid, flaky ham or turkey loaf. There were cellophane-wrapped packets of hardtack biscuits, dense and salty. There was a bar of chocolate, not the bitter, oily chocolate of their memory, but sweet, creamy and real, fortified with vitamins. There were fruit bars, chewing gum, and packets of sugar and salt. And most astonishing of all, there were small, foil-wrapped packets of genuine roasted and ground coffee, not ersatz, not roasted grain, real, aromatic coffee beans. For men who had forgotten the very smell, the scent that wafted up when they tore the packet open was a Proustian Madeleine that transported them instantly to a peacetime world of café tables and family breakfasts, a world they had believed was lost forever. The processing continued, a blur of fingerprint ink, barked questions in broken German, and long, weary marches under guard. They were herded into temporary enclosures, vast fields encircled by multiple layers of concertina wire, watchtowers manned by guards with machine guns silhouetted against the sky. The landscape was dotted with thousands of other prisoners, a sea of grey-green despair stretching to the horizon. But in their hands, they clutched the American rations. They ate slowly, methodically, savouring every crumb, every shred of meat, every morsel of chocolate. Some wept silently, their tears cutting clean trails through the grime and sweat on their cheeks. This was not the treatment they had been prepared for. This was not the behaviour of a barbaric enemy. This was the first, bewildering chapter in a story that was about to become increasingly incredible, a story that would challenge every assumption they held about the world, the war, and themselves. Days turned into a week, a monotonous cycle of waiting, sleeping on the bare ground, and receiving more American rations. The journey proper began with the march to the coast. Long, weary columns of prisoners, guarded by jeeps and stern-faced MPs, trudged along roads choked with the endless supply lines of the Allied juggernaut. They passed staggering convoys of trucks, tanks and artillery pieces, a seemingly inexhaustible river of men and material flowing toward the front. The scale of the American industrial effort was on full display, a silent, crushing lesson in logistics and economic power. They arrived at the port of Marseille, a city teeming with the machinery of war. The harbour was a forest of ship masts and cranes, with liberty ships and larger transport vessels loading and unloading amidst a frenzy of activity. And there, waiting for them, were the ships that would carry them across the ocean, the USS West Point, the SS Monticello, massive transport vessels whose hulls rose from the water like iron cliffs, their grey paint streaked with rust and salt. The sight instilled a fresh wave of primal dread. The holds of ships were where prisoners were stuffed like sardines, where disease ran rampant in the darkness, where men suffocated from lack of air and died of thirst. They boarded up the steep gangways with heavy hearts, expecting the worst, preparing themselves for a floating hell. The reality was, once again, a profound and disorienting shock. The holds were indeed crowded, filled with row upon row of triple-tiered metal bunks, each with a thin mattress and a single blanket. But they were not the dark, airless pits of their fears. Electric bulbs provided constant illumination. Powerful ventilation systems hummed, pulling in fresh sea air. There were designated latrine and washing facilities that were regularly cleaned and functional. There was a schedule, a rigid rhythm to the day that spoke of organization and control rather than neglect and brutality. And then there was the food. It was not just the emergency K-rations anymore. It was hot, cooked meals, served in a designated mess hall on the ship. They lined up with their metal trays and were served stew thick with chunks of beef, carrots and potatoes. There was bread, not the hardtack of the rations, but freshly baked, soft, white bread. There was rice pudding, canned fruit, and on occasion the impossible luxury of a fresh orange or an apple. The German prisoners, men from a continent where fresh fruit was a distant memory for most civilians, would hold these vibrant, colourful treasures in their hands, smelling their sun-ripened scent, their minds struggling to reconcile this tangible reality with the propaganda of a starving, struggling America. The voyage across the Atlantic became a surreal, liminal period, a 3-week passage between worlds. They were suspended between the war-torn continent of their past and the unknown future of their captivity, between their identity as soldiers and their new reality as prisoners. The vast, empty ocean, stretching to the horizon in every direction, was a perfect metaphor for their own psychological state, unmoored, directionless, and filled with a strange mixture of trepidation and a nascent, fragile hope. They spent their days on deck, when allowed, watching the endless expanse of water, or in the holds, reading, talking in low voices, or simply thinking. They watched their American guards with a kind of anthropological curiosity. They saw these young men from Kansas and Pennsylvania and California discard half-eaten food, treat chocolate and chewing gum as casual snacks, and drink coffee with a nonchalance that was utterly bewildering. To the Germans, each crumb of bread was a commodity to be treasured, each ounce of coffee a precious resource. To the Americans, it was simply consumable, readily available, and endlessly replaceable. This fundamental difference in mindset, born from the chasm between abundance and scarcity, was one of the most profound cultural lessons of the entire journey. Then, one morning, a cry went up from the deck, a ripple of excitement that spread through the ship. Land had been sighted. The prisoners, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and awe, were allowed on deck, and they crowded to the rails, a mass of dark blue-dyed uniforms and pale, anxious faces. And there it was. America. First, a smudge on the horizon, then resolving into the iconic form of the Statue of Liberty, a green giantess holding her torch aloft against the morning sky. And beyond her, the skyline of New York City, a jagged, breathtaking forest of skyscrapers, the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, reaching for the clouds. There were no bomb craters, no blackened ruins, no signs of war whatsoever. The city stood whole and gleaming in the sunlight, a breathtaking testament to a prosperity and security that was almost offensive in its completeness. The stories they had been told, the Nazi narratives of a weak, decadent and struggling enemy, evaporated in that single, stunning visual. They were not being taken to a defeated nation. They were being delivered to the heart of a modern industrial empire, untouched and throbbing with power. The scale of their miscalculation, of the lie they had been living, was as vast and deep as the ocean they had just crossed. The ships did not stop in New York but continued their journey, moving down the coast or docking only to transfer their human cargo onto trains. This transfer was another exercise in American efficiency. They were marched from the ships into waiting trains, not the cramped 4, 0 and 8 boxcars of European memory, but American passenger coaches or converted freight cars with windows and seating. The train journeys that followed were another extended revelation, a days-long panorama of unimaginable scale and fertility. The trains rattled across a continent, through the industrial heartland of Pennsylvania, past the endless fields of wheat and corn in Ohio and Indiana, that stretched to the horizon like a geometric proof of agricultural wealth, a golden sea of sustenance. They saw herds of cattle and swine so numerous they darkened the plains, a living, moving protein surplus that was unimaginable in a protein-starved Europe. They passed through countless towns and cities that looked pristine and prosperous, their streets filled with well-fed civilians, new automobiles, and children playing without fear. The prisoners watched this silent, rolling newsreel of American life unfold outside their windows, a visual lecture that systematically dismantled, mile by mile, every lie they had ever been told about their enemy's weakness. Finally, after days of travel, the trains began to slow, their whistles blowing mournfully as they pulled into remote areas, often in the American South or the wide-open spaces of the Great Plains and the American West. They arrived at places with stark, simple names painted on signs: Camp Trinidad in Colorado, Camp Carson, Camp Algona in Minnesota, Camp Hearn in Texas. The gates, topped with barbed wire and flanked by guard towers, closed behind them with a heavy, metallic finality that echoed in their souls. They were now, officially, Kriegsgefangenen, prisoners of war of the United States. They stood in formation for hours under the vast, alien sky of the American West, a sky so huge and blue it felt like a physical presence. They were processed, counted, deloused with DDT powder that smelled of chemicals and cleanliness, and issued new uniforms. These were their old German tunics and trousers, but now dyed a dark navy blue and marked with large white letters on the jacket back and the trouser leg. PW, The dye job was a deliberate measure to make escape more difficult, but it also felt like a final branding, a visual erasure of their military identity. The initial sharp fear of execution or torture began to morph into a weary, deep-seated resignation. This collection of barracks, fences, and towers was to be their home for the duration of the war. The duration was an abstract concept, a timeline without an end date, and the weight of that uncertainty settled upon them. They were assigned to barracks' long, single-story wooden buildings built on concrete foundations, lined with neat rows of metal-framed cots, each with a mattress stuffed with straw or cotton. The buildings were Spartan but weather-tight, heated by pot-bellied stoves for the winter, and equipped with washing facilities and latrines in separate buildings. It was functional, clean, and organized. It was, once again, not the squalid hell they had anticipated. The Americans provided them with blankets, soap, towels, and basic toiletries. The order and the provision for basic hygiene were yet another sign that they were dealing with a system that followed rules, a system that saw them not as subhumans to be abused, but as human beings to be managed. But the true shock, the moment that would be seared into their memories for decades to come, the core of the entire incredible story, was still ahead of them. It was a shock that would not come from a guard's rifle or a commandant's order, but from a low, long building near the center of the camp, from which a symphony of smells was emanating. It was the mess hall. The first whispers of it came on the wind, a scent that triggered something deep and primal in their malnourished bodies, a scent that bypassed the brain and spoke directly to the stomach, to the memory, to the soul. It was the smell of baking bread, not the sour, heavy Vollkornbrot of home, but the light, yeasty, almost sweet aroma of American white bread baking in industrial ovens. It was the rich, fatty, savory perfume of roasting meat, real pork, real beef in quantities that filled the air with a promise of satiety. It was the sharp, energizing scent of real coffee, brewing in vast, stainless steel urns. It was the smell of abundance, a smell most of them had not experienced since their childhoods, before the war, before the shortages, before the slow, grinding descent into universal hunger. As evening fell, the order was given. The men formed lines outside the mess hall, their stomachs clenched with a hunger that was as much emotional as it was physical. They shuffled forward, the line moving with a steady, relentless pace, each step bringing the source of the intoxicating aromas closer. The sounds from within grew louder. The clatter of metal trays, the splash of food being ladled, the deep, muffled voices of the American cooks. And then they saw it. The serving line was a tableau of impossible, dreamlike plenty. American cooks and German personal kitchen staff stood behind a steam table, a long stainless steel counter with multiple compartments, each filled with a different food, each steaming and vibrant. Each prisoner received a sectioned metal tray, and onto it was placed a sequence of wonders. A large, steaming scoop of mashed potatoes, not pale and watery, but a rich, creamy yellow, visibly laden with real butter and milk. Next to it, a generous portion of roast pork, glistening with a rich, brown gravy, the meat tender and falling apart. A heap of green beans, cooked until tender but still firm, seasoned with salt and pork fat. A thick, soft, white dinner roll with a pat of genuine butter already melting into its warm, soft interior. A small, perfect red apple, so shiny it looked polished. And finally, a heavy ceramic mug filled to the brim with dark, black, real coffee, into which they could, from a communal bowl, stir a spoonful of pure, white, crystalline sugar. The sight was so overwhelming, so contrary to every expectation and every recent experience, that a deep, reverential silence fell over the German soldiers. It was a silence of profound, utter disbelief. This was not a prisoner's meal. This was a feast. This was more food, and better food, than they had seen on a single plate since before the war began. This was more in both quantity and quality than their families back home saw in an entire week, if they were lucky. This was the food of the victors, and they, the defeated, were being given a full share. They found spots at the long wooden tables and sat, not talking, simply staring at the food before them, as if it were a mirage that would vanish if they looked away. Then, tentatively, they began to eat. They ate with a slow, intense concentration, savoring every single flavor. The savory, juicy richness of the pork exploded on their tongues. The creamy, comforting smoothness of the butter-laden potatoes was a physical solace. The sweet, crisp, clean crunch of the apple was a taste of pure, unadulterated nature. The coffee, hot and strong and sweetened with real sugar, sent a jolt of warmth and well-being through their systems. For many, it was the first truly nutritious, balanced, and abundant meal they had consumed in 3, 4, or even 5 years. Their bodies, accustomed to drawing on meager reserves and breaking down their own tissue, sang with the sudden massive influx of calories, proteins, fats, and vitamins. It was a physiological shock as profound as the psychological one. That night, in the barracks, there was no boisterous conversation, no songs, no jokes. The men lay in their bunks, their stomachs full to the point of discomfort, their minds reeling, trying to process the sensory and emotional overload of the day, the sight of America from the train, the arrival at the camp, the processing, and finally, the meal. The sheer scale of the experience had left them mentally exhausted. They were caught in a complex, tangled web of powerful, conflicting emotions. There was a profound, almost religious gratitude for this humane, this generous treatment. There was a deep, unsettling confusion, as their entire worldview, built over years of indoctrination and experience, was being forcibly and rapidly restructured. And underpinning it all, there was guilt, a deep, gnawing, sickening guilt that they were here, in this clean, safe, warm place, with full bellies, while their brothers, fathers, and sons were still fighting and dying in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, or in the collapsing lines in France, and while their mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters were scavenging for food in the bombed-out, freezing, starving cities of the fatherland. They had expected hardship, brutality, and starvation. They had found order, cleanliness, routine, and shocking, unbelievable, overwhelming plenty. The shooting war, for them, was over. But a new, more subtle and complex psychological battle had just begun, a battle fought not with rifles and mortars, but with memories, with guilt, and with the daily, shocking evidence of American food served on a metal tray. The new reality of captivity began not with a shout or a threat, but with a sound, the clear, piercing notes of a bugle cutting through the cold, thin air of a Colorado dawn. For the German prisoners at Camp Trinidad, this 5 a.m. reveille was the first thread in the daily tapestry of a meticulously structured existence. It was a sound that spoke not of the chaos of the front, but of order, of routine, of a system that governed every aspect of life from the moment the sun breached the jagged line of the Rocky Mountains to the moment it disappeared behind them. This was the architecture of their new world, a world built not upon the foundation of punishment they had anticipated, but upon the sturdy, unyielding pillars of regulation and routine. And at the very center of this architecture, its beating heart and most profound expression, was the provision of food. Roll call followed the bugle call with metronomic precision. The prisoners, their breaths pluming in the chill, assembled in the compound, forming ragged lines under the watchful eyes of the American sergeants. The counting began, a slow, methodical process of tallying heads, of ensuring that the human inventory matched the ledger. This military formality was a constant, daily reminder of their status as property, as numbered assets of the United States government. Yet, it was conducted with a bored, administrative efficiency that stripped it of overt malice. It was simply a procedure, one of many that would define their days. After the final count was verified, the men were dismissed, and the line for the mess hall began to form, with an alacrity that spoke of a continued, deepening disbelief and an eager, almost childlike anticipation. The breakfast that awaited them was, like the dinner of the previous evening, a revelation that recalibrated their understanding of the world. It was not the meager German frontline breakfast of a dry crust of black bread and a cup of bitter ersatz coffee. It was a meal of substance, of variety, of genuine nourishment. There were platters of scrambled eggs, vast quantities of them, fluffy and bright yellow, glistening with butter. There were strips of bacon, fried to a crisp, salty perfection, or links of sausage, seasoned and sizzling. There were stacks of pancakes, light and golden, served with thick maple syrup or canned peaches. There were bowls of oatmeal porridge, hot and creamy. And there was milk, real, fresh, cold milk and orange juice, a vibrant, tangy liquid that tasted like captured sunshine, a flavour so alien and joyful it was almost shocking. The German prisoners, many of whom came from farming backgrounds, understood the silent language of agriculture. They saw the eggs and instinctively calculated the immense population of laying hens required to produce them for hundreds of thousands of men. They saw the milk and visualized the vast, healthy dairy herds grazing on endless pastures. They saw the bacon and understood the robust state of the American swine industry. The evidence presented on their divided metal trays was an incontrovertible testament to a nation with its agricultural infrastructure not just intact, but operating at a level of miraculous, unprecedented productivity, a world away from the plundered and exhausted lands of Europe. This abundance was not a matter of chance or capricious generosity. It was the direct, deliberate result of the United States government's strict and unwavering adherence to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. The American military, bound by its own sense of honor and a pragmatic desire to maintain a standard of conduct, took its legal and moral obligations with profound seriousness. The Convention's Article 11 was explicit: the food ration of prisoners of war shall be equivalent in quantity and quality to that of the depot troops of the detaining power. In simpler, more crushing terms, this meant the Germans were to be fed the same as American soldiers stationed at base camps within the United States. For the prisoners, this legal clause meant they had suddenly, inexplicably, become beneficiaries of the most powerful and efficient agricultural economy on Earth, an economy supercharged by the demands of total war and miraculously untouched by the physical destruction that had crippled Europe's farmland, shattered its distribution networks, and consigned its civilian populations to a slow, grinding hunger. The logistics that materialized this daily miracle were a marvel of American organization and industrial-scale planning. The camp's quartermaster, a figure of immense responsibility, was tasked with sourcing and managing staggering quantities of provisions. His domain was the camp commissary, a long, warehouse-like building that served as the temple of this strange abundance. Supply trucks, part of the endless convoys that crisscrossed the American continent, arrived with a regularity that itself was a form of magic. They disgorged 100-pound sacks of white flour and pure cane sugar, entire sides of beef and pork hung from hooks in refrigerated trucks, crates of fresh, canned and dried vegetables, huge, waxy blocks of butter and cheese, and sacks of genuine coffee beans, whose aroma alone was a powerful intoxicant. The commissary's shelves were stocked high and deep, a visual symphony of organized plenty. Its cold storage rooms hummed with the constant, reassuring sound of mechanical refrigeration, preserving meats and dairy products that in Germany would have been unimaginable luxuries. This was the back end, the engine room of the prisoner's full-bellied reality. The American cooks, often working alongside German POWs assigned to kitchen duty, were the alchemists who transformed these raw materials into the meals that defined the prisoner's existence. The German Küchenpersonal, or kitchen staff, were given a significant degree of autonomy, encouraged by the camp administration to prepare the rations in ways that suited their national palate. This policy was both pragmatic, as it improved morale, and subtly psychological, a gesture of respect for their cultural identity. The German cooks, therefore, became crucial figures within the camp's social hierarchy. They demonstrated remarkable skill and creativity, baking dark, dense, rye-style breads in the camp ovens alongside the American white bread, creating a tangible, aromatic link to home. They made soups and stews thick, hearty Eintopf that tasted of German tradition, but with an ingredient base of meat and vegetables that was far superior to anything available in the fatherland for years. The American kitchen staff, often simple farm boys or city lads with no particular culinary expertise, would look on with a kind of professional admiration. The respect of one craftsman for another began to transcend the barriers of language and nationality. This collaboration in the steamy, fragrant confines of the camp kitchen was one of the first and most important spaces of genuine, unforced cultural exchange, a place where the war faded into the background supplanted by the universal language of food preparation. The daily schedule was rigid and all-encompassing, providing a framework that gave purpose to the long, potentially empty days of captivity. After breakfast, work details were assembled. The Geneva Convention explicitly permitted the use of enlisted men for labor, and the American authorities, facing a domestic manpower shortage, made full and efficient use of this provision. Prisoners were organized into groups and sent out under armed guard to work on local farms, in logging camps, on road construction crews, and on soil conservation projects. This labor was not only a practical way to offset the cost of their captivity, it was also a crucial psychological release valve, a chance to physically leave the confines of the barbed wire compound, to feel the sun and the wind, and to engage in meaningful, productive work that reminded them of their own capacity and strength. The work on farms was, for many city boys from Hamburg or Berlin, a novel and enlightening experience. For those from rural areas of Bavaria or the Rhineland, it was a familiar comfort, a return to the rhythms of the soil. They found themselves in the vast fields of the American heartland, harvesting sugar beets in the shadow of the Colorado mountains, picking cotton under the Arkansas sun, or tending to fruit orchards in the gentle hills of New York. The farmers who employed them were initially wary, even hostile, their minds filled with images of the enemy from newsreels. But this wariness often gave way to a grudging pragmatism, and eventually to a quiet respect. The Germans were, by and large, disciplined, skilled, and hard workers. They approached their tasks with a methodical thoroughness that impressed the American farmers. The sight of these former enemy soldiers, their dark blue uniforms stark against the golden wheat or the green rows of crops, working diligently in American fields under the vast, open sky, was a surreal image of a world turned upside down, a living portrait of the war's strange contradictions. And during their work breaks they were fed. The lunches provided in the field were, once again, a source of profound astonishment. They were given sandwiches, a simple concept, yet one that embodied American abundance made with thick slices of soft white bread, generous portions of real meat like roast beef or ham, and slices of yellow cheese. They had fruit, apples, oranges or bananas, cookies, and thermoses of hot coffee. The American guards ate the same food, often sitting nearby on the same logs or in the same shade of a tree. In these moments, the shared meal created a temporary, unspoken truce, a fragile bubble of common humanity centered on the universal, leveling need for sustenance. There was no fraternization, no friendly chatter, but the act of eating together, of satisfying the same basic hunger, subtly eroded the absolute division between captor and captive. Back within the camp's wire boundaries, the afternoons were often dedicated to leisure and personal improvement, a provision as surprising as the food itself. The Geneva Convention guaranteed prisoners the right to intellectual and physical pursuits, and the American authorities, eager to maintain order and morale, actively and intelligently encouraged it. The camps, therefore, transformed from mere holding pens into hives of vibrant, self-generated activity. Education programs flourished with an intensity that spoke of a deep thirst for normalcy and mental engagement. Prisoners with particular skills, university students, engineers, teachers, craftsmen, offered formal and informal classes to their comrades. The barracks became makeshift classrooms where men gathered to learn mathematics, history, geography, and foreign languages, especially English. American universities, through the YMCA and other organizations, sometimes provided correspondence courses, and the prisoners, their minds no longer wholly preoccupied with the primal struggle for survival, immersed themselves in study with a fervor that was both an escape and an investment in a future they could not yet envision. Sports became a massive, integral part of camp life, a physical and emotional outlet of immense importance. The prisoners organized elaborate, fiercely competitive soccer leagues, with teams representing different German regions or their former military units. They built their own goals from scrap lumber and marked their own pitches on the dusty ground of the compound. The matches were major events, watched by hundreds of fellow prisoners who cheered with a passion that momentarily drowned out their homesickness and anxiety. The Americans, in turn, introduced them to baseball, a game the Germans found bafflingly complex with its arcane rules and strategies, but one they gradually came to understand and even enjoy. The sound of a soccer ball being kicked, the sharp crack of a baseball bat, the shouted calls and cheers of players and spectators, these were the sounds of men actively rebuilding a semblance of community, of normal life, from the ground up. The arts also thrived in this unlikely environment, a testament to the enduring human need for creation and beauty. Prisoners who were musicians formed orchestras and bands, crafting their own instruments with breathtaking ingenuity, a guitar body carved from a wooden crate with strings salvaged from electrical wire, a violin painstakingly shaped and assembled, a drum made from a stretched canvas and a metal tub. They performed classical concerts and popular tunes, the music floating over the barbed wire, a temporary balm for the soul. Others took up painting with donated supplies, sketching portraits of their comrades or landscapes from memory. Woodcarving became a popular pastime, with men producing intricate figures, chess sets, and decorative boxes. They staged theatrical productions in the mess hall, building sets from scrap materials and sewing costumes, losing themselves for a few precious hours in the roles of characters from a world at peace. At the commercial and social center of this vibrant internal world was the camp canteen. This was the internal economy of the camp, a place where the abstract concept of their labor was translated into tangible goods. For their work, enlisted men earned 80 cents per day in camp scrip, a pittance by American standards, but a small fortune to men with no other means. This scrip could be used to purchase small luxuries that made the stark reality of captivity significantly more bearable. The canteen's shelves held American cigarettes, chocolate bars, shaving soap, stationery, toothpaste, and sometimes, remarkably, even American beer. The simple, profound act of choosing, of browsing the shelves, of making a purchase, was a powerful restorative to their sense of individual agency in a life otherwise defined by external control and regimentation. It was a small but crucial reminder that they were still men with preferences, with desires, with the ability to make decisions for themselves. But the most poignant, psychologically complex, and emotionally draining activity remained letter writing. The international mail system, though slow, unreliable, and subject to rigorous censorship by both sides, was a fragile, vital lifeline to the world they had lost, a world that was rapidly fading into a nightmare of memory. The prisoners spent hours hunched over small desks or on their bunks, carefully composing letters to their families. The process was an exercise in delicate navigation. They had to choose words that would pass the censor's indifferent eye, but still convey the profound strangeness of their reality. They wrote extensively, obsessively, about the food. They described their meals in lavish, meticulous, almost worshipful detail, the thickness and marbling of the steak, the sharp, creamy flavor of the cheese, the impossible sweetness of the canned peaches, the comforting weight of the fresh bread. They knew, with a certainty that twisted their guts, that their families in Germany were struggling, starving, and their detailed descriptions were a desperate, inadequate way of sharing their fortune, of offering a vicarious feast to their starving loved ones. It was an act of love laced with a deep, persistent agony. Receiving mail from Germany was a bittersweet experience that could define a man's mood for days. The letters, when they finally arrived after a journey of months, were often thin, written on poor quality paper, and filled with news that was already tragically outdated. They told stories of escalating deprivation, of cities reduced to mountains of rubble by around-the-clock, Allied bombing, of the desperate daily search for a single potato or a lump of coal. They contained news of deaths, sons and brothers killed on the disintegrating fronts, parents killed in air raids, children lost to disease and hunger. A prisoner would read these letters in his clean, warm, well-lit barracks, his stomach still full from a hearty lunch, and a profound, crippling, inescapable guilt would wash over him, a cold wave that suffocated all other feeling. This was the central, painful paradox of their existence. They were healthier, safer, and better fed than they had been in years, living a life of relative comfort, while the people they loved most in the world were suffering unimaginable hardships, living in cellars, and facing a daily struggle for survival. This guilt became a constant, silent companion for many, a shadow that fell across every moment of pleasure, every satisfied belly, every laugh at a soccer game. It was the price they paid for their salvation. The American guards and camp administrators, particularly the more observant among them, were not blind to this complex and painful psychology. While their primary duty was the maintenance of security and order, many of them, especially those who interacted with the prisoners daily, developed a nuanced, almost anthropological understanding of their charges. They saw the young men, not as the fanatical Nazi supermen of propaganda, but as defeated soldiers, as human beings caught in the immense, indifferent gears of history. Interactions between guards and prisoners remained formal and within the bounds of regulations, but they were not always hostile. Small, human exchanges occurred. They traded basic language lessons, a German word for an English one. They shared photographs of wives, children, and sweethearts, the universal currency of love and longing. They discussed music and sports, finding common ground in a shared appreciation for a Beethoven symphony or the athletic prowess of a soccer player. The guards, many of whom were second-generation Americans of German descent, sometimes found a strange, unspoken connection with the prisoners, their shared heritage creating a subtle, unacknowledged bond that complicated the simple narrative of enemy and captor. As the seasons turned, the prisoners settled into the rhythm of their new life, a rhythm dictated by the American bugle and the turning of the earth. The sharp, clean air of the Colorado mountains gave way to the vibrant fire of an autumn that painted the aspen trees gold, then to a bitter, snow-laden winter that piled deep, silent drifts against the wooden sides of the barracks. Inside, the pot-bellied stoves glowed cherry red, radiating a comforting warmth that stood in stark contrast to the unheated misery of the German front lines or the freezing apartments of home. The food changed with the season's heartier stews and thick soups in the winter, more fresh vegetables and salads in the summer. The initial sharp shock of abundance gradually faded, replaced by a routine acceptance, a new normal. The camp became their entire world, a microcosm with its own rules, its own economy, its own social hierarchies and dramas. They had been captured, transported across an ocean, and placed in a cage. But it was a cage made of barbed wire and military regulation, not of starvation, brutality, and neglect. It was a cage where they were, against all odds and every expectation, being well and truly fed. This fundamental, astonishing fact was now reshaping their bodies, filling them out, putting colour in their cheeks. And slowly, inexorably, it was also reshaping their minds, challenging their deepest beliefs, and forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about their enemies, the war, and the very nature of the world beyond the wire. The physical transformation of the German prisoners of war was both rapid and remarkable, a visible alteration that occurred with the relentless certainty of a natural process. Within a mere 3 months of their capture, the gaunt, hollow-cheeked soldiers who had stumbled out of the Norman hedgerows or surrendered in the North African desert were virtually unrecognizable. The sharp, angular planes of their faces softened, filling out with healthy tissue. Their complexions, once bearing the grey, waxy pallor of chronic malnutrition and exhaustion, were now tanned and ruddy from long hours of outdoor work and recreation under the vast American sky. Their uniforms, the dark blue dyed fabric that had initially hung loosely on their emaciated frames, now stretched taut across shoulders that had regained their muscle mass, over chests that were no longer skeletal, and against bellies that were flat and firm, not concave with hunger. When they stood for their periodic medical examinations, the American doctors would note the changes with professional satisfaction. The scales told a consistent, undeniable story. Weight gains of 15, 20, even 30 pounds were common. The stethoscopes revealed stronger, steadier heartbeats. The eyes, once dull with despair, now showed a clearer, sharper focus. The American Medical Corps was fulfilling its duty under the Geneva Convention to maintain the health of its charges, and the results were physically manifest. For the prisoners themselves, this dramatic physical change was a source of deep and persistent psychological conflict, a paradox that gnawed at them even as their bodies grew stronger. On one hand, it felt undeniably good to be physically whole again, to have energy that was not immediately consumed by the basic act of survival, to feel strength returning to limbs that had been weak and trembling, to not be constantly, obsessively preoccupied with the gnawing, empty ache in their stomachs. This was a form of liberation. The relentless hunger that had been their silent, desperate companion for years had been silenced. Their bodies, finally receiving adequate and continuous supplies of protein, fats, carbohydrates, and essential vitamins, were repairing the accumulated damage of years of deprivation. Old wounds, poorly healed on the front, mended better. Chronic coughs and respiratory ailments disappeared. Their hair grew thicker and shone with health. Their skin lost its lesions and the sallow tone of deficiency. They were, by any objective medical measure, in better physical condition than they had been since before the war began. But this very health, this visible well-being, was a constant, nagging source of guilt, a shame that festered in the quiet moments. It was a visible, tangible betrayal of the suffering back home. When a prisoner looked at his reflection in a barrack window, or caught his profile in a polished mess hall urn, he did not just see a healthier man. He saw a man who was thriving, his body a living monument to American abundance, while his wife grew thinner, while his children's ribs began to show through their pale skin, while his parents aged prematurely from hardship and hunger. This survivor's guilt, though the clinical term did not yet exist in the common lexicon, became a defining feature of the POW psyche. The food, for all its life-sustaining goodness, became the potent symbol of this schism. Every savory bite of roast beef was a reminder that his family was likely eating a thin, bitter soup made from turnips and potato peelings. Every sweet, creamy mouthful of ice cream, a luxury the Americans occasionally provided on hot summer days, was accompanied by the bitter aftertaste of knowing his daughter had never, in her conscious memory, tasted such a magical, cold confection. The act of eating, which should have been a simple pleasure, became a complex emotional transaction, laden with anxiety and a sense of unpayable debt. This internal struggle manifested in a spectrum of behaviors, each a coping mechanism for the same unbearable tension. Some prisoners became withdrawn and melancholic, pushing their food around their plates during meals, their appetites utterly diminished by the weight of their worry. They would eat just enough to sustain themselves, their feasting a silent protest against a fate they felt they did not deserve. Others reacted in the opposite manner, eating voraciously, almost desperately, as if trying to consume enough for two, for their entire family, a physical impossibility that only led to physical discomfort and deeper spirals of self-loathing. They developed private, poignant rituals around eating. A man would carefully save a piece of his chocolate bar or a single, perfect cookie from his canteen purchases, wrapping it in paper and hiding it in his footlocker. It was a symbolic gesture, a tiny, impossible store of nourishment he hopelessly hoped to one day transport across the ocean and present to his starving child. These hidden stashes of food were not for later consumption. They were secular relics, physical manifestations of a love that could not bridge the distance of war. The camp administrators and the more perceptive American guards understood this dynamic intuitively, even if they lacked the psychological vocabulary to name it. They saw the haunted, distant looks in the men's eyes during mail call, when letters from Germany, with their familiar, fragile handwriting, brought news of ever-worsening conditions, of air raids, of deaths, of the slow, grinding collapse of civilian life. There was little the Americans could do to alleviate this specific pain, but the very structure they imposed upon camp life provided a form of rudimentary, occupational therapy. The relentless busyness of the day, the pre-dawn roll call, the work details that burned physical energy, the educational classes that demanded mental focus, the organized sports that required competitive spirit was, in part, a deliberate strategy to prevent the corrosive effects of idleness and the profound melancholy that inevitably accompanied it. A busy prisoner was a manageable prisoner from a security standpoint, but a busy prisoner also had less uninterrupted time to sit and dwell on the miseries of those he had left behind, to be paralyzed by the guilt that his full stomach inspired. The cultural education of the prisoners continued apace, though now it was less about shock and more about a gradual, deepening understanding of the strange land that held them. The American guards, simply by being themselves, by going about their daily duties, were a constant source of fascination and quiet study. The Germans observed the casual, almost irreverent democracy that defined American military life. They saw low-ranking privates joking with sergeants in a way that would be unthinkable in the rigidly hierarchical German army, where discipline was enforced with absolute authority. They saw the informal, sometimes sloppy way the Americans carried themselves on duty, their lack of rigid, Prussian-style formality, their easy laughter and open displays of emotion. This was a sharp, continuous contrast to the controlled, disciplined, and emotionally restrained society they had known, a society that had ultimately led them to conquest and then to catastrophic ruin. Nowhere was this fundamental cultural difference more apparent, more daily and tangible, than in the American attitude toward food itself. The Germans, coming from a culture that had known increasing scarcity for a decade, treated food with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. A meal was a ritual, an event. Every crumb was valuable, every scrap had potential use. They watched, with a mixture of horror, fascination, and moral outrage, as American guards would casually discard a half-eaten apple, throw away the crusts of their bread, or leave a portion of meat uneaten on their plates in the mess hall. This was not done out of malice or a specific desire to flaunt their wealth. It was simply a reflection of a national mindset born of seemingly limitless abundance, a subconscious belief that there was always more where that came from. To waste what was so precious, so miraculous, was, to the German prisoners, a kind of blasphemy, a profound failure to understand the true value of things. It created a persistent cognitive dissonance that was difficult for them to resolve. These were the same men who fed them so well, who treated their wounds with kindness, who followed the rules of war with such scrupulousness, who often showed them basic human decency, yet they were capable of this casual, unthinking wastefulness. It was a paradox that seemed to define America itself in their eyes, a nation of immense, genuine generosity and a profound, almost innocent carelessness, all existing simultaneously within the same character. The changing seasons in America brought new sensory experiences and introduced them to entirely foreign culinary traditions. The autumn of 1944, with its spectacular display of fiery colors in the Colorado aspens, introduced the German prisoners to an alien and conceptually challenging holiday, Thanksgiving. The camp kitchens prepared a special, extravagant meal for the occasion, and the American guards and administrators did their best to explain the concept. A day for giving thanks, they said, for the bounty of the harvest, for family, for freedom, for the blessings of the past year. The prisoners listened politely, but the underlying concept was difficult for them to fully grasp. To set aside a specific day for giving thanks for what one already had, so openly and so lavishly, seemed strange, almost decadent, when half the world was on its knees, merely giving thanks for having survived another day, for what little they had managed to scavenge or save from destruction. The Thanksgiving meal itself was a spectacle of abundance that surpassed even their now adjusted expectations. The centerpiece was the roast turkey, a large, bronzed bird that most of the Germans had only ever read about in books or seen in illustrations. It was carved and served with a reverence that even they could appreciate. Then came the accompaniments. Cranberry sauce, a sweet and startlingly tart jellied condiment that baffled their palates. Stuffing, a savory bread mixture cooked inside the bird. Sweet potatoes, candied with marshmallows, a combination of flavors and textures that seemed bizarre and unsettling to the European sensibility, and a bewildering array of pies. And finally, there was the pumpkin pie. The Germans examined this particular dessert with deep suspicion and curiosity. A vegetable, made into a sweet pie? It defied all known culinary logic of the German kitchen. Yet, when they tentatively tasted it, another layer of the American mystery was unlocked. The smooth, spiced filling, the flaky, buttery crust it was, against all their expectations, delicious. It was another quiet lesson in American practicality and innovation, in their confident willingness to experiment and their boundless optimism in turning anything, even a humble gourd, into a source of delight and celebration. As the vibrant autumn succumbed to the deep snows of winter, and 1944 bled into the fateful year of 1945, the war news, which the prisoners followed with intense, anxious interest on carefully hidden clandestine radios, and through carefully read, censored camp newspapers, began to turn decisively and irrevocably against Germany. The Battle of the Bulge, the Reich's last desperate major offensive in the West, had sputtered and failed in the frozen Ardennes forest at a terrible cost. In the East, the Soviet steamroller, fueled by a deep, vengeful fury, was advancing relentlessly toward the very borders of the Reich itself. The mood within the camps grew increasingly somber and tense. The prisoners knew the end was approaching, hurtling toward them, and with it, a final, terrible reckoning. Their anxiety subtly shifted. It was no longer primarily about their own treatment, which had been consistently and surprisingly humane, but about the apocalyptic fate awaiting their homeland and the families trapped within it. The letters from home, when they arrived, became even more desperate, describing cities transformed into moonscapes, of lawlessness, and of a famine that was tightening its grip with each passing day. This growing internal anxiety was compounded by a subtle but noticeable change in their own immediate circumstances within the camps. As the American public became more aware, through newspaper reports and radio broadcasts, of the conditions inside the POW camps, a murmur of discontent and anger began to grow. Public opinion questioned why the enemy, the men who had been trying to kill American boys just months before, were being fed so well, why they were playing soccer and putting on orchestral concerts, while American sons and brothers were fighting and dying in the hellish battles of the Hurtgen forest and the Italian mountains. There were vocal calls in Congress and in the press to tighten the rules, to reduce the rations, to make the captivity more appropriately punitive, to make the prisoners feel the sting of their defeat. Bowing to this public and political pressure, the War Department in Washington issued new, stricter directives in early 1945. The food, while still adequate and nutritionally sufficient to meet the Geneva Convention standards, became noticeably plainer, more utilitarian. The more luxurious items, the occasional ice cream, the better cuts of meat, the fresh fruit became less frequent or vanished altogether. The cuts of meat were often tougher, stewed rather than roasted. The butter was sometimes replaced with margarine. The sugar ration was reduced. It was, in the grand scheme, a minor reduction, but the prisoners felt it keenly. It was a psychological lever, a reminder that their comfortable, insulated existence was contingent upon the whims of their captors and the mood of the American public. It was a taste of the real world, a world of scarcity and judgment intruding upon their artificial paradise. It prepared them, in a small but significant way, for the end of the war and the inevitable end of their privileged status as prisoners of a nation that scrupulously followed international law. Then, in April of 1945, news came that reverberated through the camp like a physical shock, affecting guards and prisoners alike. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was dead. The prisoners observed the genuine, unfeigned grief of their American guards. They saw the flags lowered to half-mast all across the camp, the somber, worried faces, the conversations conducted in hushed, disbelieving tones. For the prisoners, particularly the officers and the more politically aware among them, it was a moment of unexpected and complex empathy. They understood the significance of losing a national leader in the midst of a global war. They felt a strange, reflexive pang of sympathy for their captors, a recognition of a shared human experience in the face of monumental, history-altering change. The death of this American titan made the world feel suddenly more unstable, more dangerous, for everyone, regardless of which side of the wire they stood on. Finally, on the 7th of May 1945, the news they had been simultaneously expecting and dreading for months arrived. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The announcement was made to the assembled prisoners in the main compound by the camp commandant, his voice flat and official. A strange, profound silence fell over the hundreds of men, a silence broken only by the relentless western wind. There were no cheers of relief, no cries of despair or anger, just a massive, collective exhale, the sound of a shared destiny finally reaching its terminus. The immense, overarching structure that had defined their lives for years, the war, the cause, the struggle, had suddenly, irrevocably vanished. They were no longer prisoners of war in an ongoing conflict. They were simply prisoners, the defeated citizens of a destroyed nation, a nation that no longer legally existed. The purpose of their captivity, from a military standpoint, had evaporated. They were now a problem to be solved, an administrative headache, a population in limbo. In the days and weeks that followed the surrender, the change within the camp became more pronounced and psychologically unsettling. The work details continued, but the spirit behind them was different. The sense of shared, if opposing, purpose was gone. The war was over. Why were they still cutting wood or building roads? The food rations were further reduced, both as a practical measure and as a continued psychological message. The meals now consisted mainly of hearty but plain porridge, thick pea soup, and the soft white bread. The message was unambiguous. The special status afforded by the Geneva Convention during active hostilities was being phased out. They were now a cost centre, a population to be managed prior to repatriation. The comfortable, predictable rhythm of the camp was disintegrating. The prisoners found themselves cast adrift in a state of profound limbo, caught between the known, structured world of the camp and the terrifying, complete unknown of a post-war Germany. They had spent the last year or more being physically rebuilt and mentally challenged by the nation that had defeated them. They were healthier, better fed, and often better educated than when they had arrived. They had experienced a standard of living and a culture of abundance that they knew with certainty no longer existed anywhere in Europe. The full belly that had been a source of comfort, then guilt, now became a source of a new, peculiar fear. How would they readjust to the starvation and devastation that undoubtedly awaited them at home? How would they explain their good health, their strong bodies, to their emaciated families? How could they possibly bridge the chasm between the world of plenty they had inhabited and the world of ash and hunger they were about to re-enter? The abundant food of the American camps, which had been their salvation and their shame, had now become their burden, a tangible barrier that separated them from the grim reality they were destined to face, a last, bittersweet taste of a life that could have been, in a world that was no more. The end of the shooting war in Europe in May 1945 did not signal a corresponding end to captivity for the German POWs in America. Instead, it ushered in a new, profoundly uncertain phase, a period of limbo that was in many ways more psychologically taxing than the structured certainty of wartime imprisonment. The neat, regulated world of the camp, governed by the clear rules of the Geneva Convention, began to slowly unravel. The sense of purpose, however opposed to their own cause, that had been imposed by the strict schedule and the necessary work details, evaporated overnight, replaced by a pervasive, gnawing anxiety about a future that was completely opaque. The men were now officially designated as disarmed enemy forces, a cold, bureaucratic term that did little to clarify their legal status or their ultimate fate. Repatriation was the stated goal, but the process was agonizingly slow, complicated by the utter devastation of the European transportation network, the political complexities of dividing a conquered Germany into competing zones of occupation, and the sheer logistical nightmare of moving hundreds of thousands of men across an ocean in ships that were now needed to bring victorious American soldiers home. During this protracted period of waiting, which stretched from months into years for some, the memory of the food, the central, shocking theme of their captivity, crystallized into the defining pillar of their entire American experience. It became the benchmark against which they measured their changing circumstances and their fading hopes. The plainer, more utilitarian rations of the immediate post-war period were a constant, tangible reminder that their time in this strange, abundant American paradise was drawing to a close. They ate their bland bowls of porridge and remembered the savory richness of the roast pork with gravy. They drank their weak, unsweetened coffee and recalled the rich, aromatic brew they had once taken for granted. The deliberate reduction in quality was a silent, potent message. The special status afforded by an active conflict was over, the abundance was receding like a tide, and the harsh, unforgiving shoreline of the real world was now pressing in upon them, its contours becoming frighteningly clear. The psychological impact of their unique captivity was now coming into its full, complex focus. These men had been the beneficiaries of one of history's most profound ironies. They had been utterly defeated on the battlefield, captured as enemies of the state, only to be transported to the heart of their enemy's land and granted a standard of living, particularly in terms of nutrition, that was, for a time, higher than that of civilians in the victorious nations of Europe. This experience had fundamentally and permanently altered their perspective on the world. The elaborate propaganda apparatus of the Nazi regime, which had painstakingly constructed an image of America as a decadent, weak, racially inferior, and culturally bankrupt society, had been systematically dismantled, brick by the daily, overwhelming evidence of their senses. They had seen American efficiency in the flawless logistics of the camp system. They had witnessed American wealth in the endless flow of food and supplies. They had experienced American generosity in the adherence to the rules of war and the basic decency shown by many of their guards. They had observed the rough-hewn, undeniable democracy of the American character. They had been defeated by this system on the battlefield, and then they had been, in a very real sense, healed by it within the confines of the barbed wire camps. This created a legacy of deep and conflicting emotions that would last a lifetime. On one hand, there was a genuine, profound gratitude for the humane treatment that had undoubtedly saved their lives and restored their health. This was not an abstract feeling, it was a physical reality, written in their stronger bodies and their clearer eyes. On the other hand, they wrestled with a deep, corrosive sense of shame and national confusion. How could they reconcile their gratitude with their shattered loyalty to a defeated and disgraced fatherland? How could they return home and describe the essential goodness of the enemy to a people who had suffered so terribly, who had lost everything, who had been subjected to a bombing campaign of apocalyptic ferocity? The food was the perfect, inescapable symbol of this internal conflict. It was the most immediate, undeniable, and visceral proof of American economic and moral superiority. But to openly acknowledge that truth felt like a final, ultimate betrayal of the homeland and the comrades who had died for it. The process of repatriation began in earnest throughout 1946, a slow-motion reversal of the journey that had brought them to America years earlier. They were marched out of the camps that had been their homes, their places of confinement and, paradoxically, of salvation. They were loaded onto the same kinds of trains, but the mood was utterly different. There was no sense of awestruck wonder at the American landscape rolling past the windows. Instead, there was a grim, silent contemplation, a mental preparation for the horrors they knew awaited them. The sight of the transport ships waiting in the East Coast harbours filled them with a dread far deeper and more existential than what they had felt on their arrival. Then, they had been frightened soldiers, expecting the worst from a mythical enemy. Now, they were defeated men, citizens of a vanished nation, returning to a national catastrophe of unimaginable scale, their own health a mark of their absence. The voyage back to Europe was a sombre, joyless affair. The mood on the ships was funereal and introspective. The men knew they were returning to a Germany in ruins. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin were wastelands of rubble, where survivors lived like moles in cellars. The national economy had ceased to exist. The Reichsmark was worthless wallpaper. And most pressing, most terrifying of all, food was even scarcer than it had been during the final, desperate months of the war. The agricultural system was in complete shambles, distribution networks were obliterated, and the upcoming winter of 1946–47 would be one of the coldest and most brutal in European history, leading to a widespread famine that would be remembered as the Hunger Winter. They were sailing from plenty into the very heart of scarcity. When the ships finally docked in European ports, often in Antwerp, Liverpool, or Le Havre the first, overwhelming shock was the smell. The air was not the clean, expansive scent of the American plains or the bracing salt air of the Atlantic. It was the thick, choking, omnipresent odor of dust, pulverized brick, decay, and uncollected garbage, the signature stench of a continent that had been beaten into submission. They were processed through transit camps, where the rations were immediately and shockingly meagre: a single, thin slice of coarse black bread, a cup of watery soup that was little more than flavored hot water. Their well-fed, robust American bodies, which had felt like a blessing and a curse in the camps, now felt like a grotesque anomaly in a world of walking skeletons. They stood out blatantly. They were visibly, physically different from the pale, emaciated, hollow-eyed civilians and returning soldiers they saw everywhere. Their health was a mark of their absence, a damning proof that they had not shared in the collective, culminating suffering of their nation. It was a stigma written in flesh and blood. The journey home, for those who still had homes to return to or who could find their families, was a brutal traverse through a landscape of utter defeat and demoralization. They saw cities that were nothing more than jagged, surreal silhouettes against a leaden sky, mountains of rubble where streets had been. They saw old men and women, their faces blank with a despair beyond tears, picking through the ruins with their bare hands, searching for a piece of wood to burn or a fragment of their former lives. They saw children with the swollen bellies and spindly limbs of kwashiorkor, their eyes too large for their faces, and they saw the looks directed at them, not just looks of curiosity, but looks of raw, accusatory judgment. The looks said, "You were safe. You were warm. You were fed." While we endured this, the guilt that had haunted them in the American barracks now became a crushing social reality. The reunions with their families were emotionally charged, chaotic, and fraught with a painful complexity that no one could have prepared for. A wife would rush to embrace her husband, her heart bursting with a decade of pent-up emotion, only to pull back momentarily, her hands feeling the solid, well-muscled frame beneath his worn coat, so different from the gaunt, fragile bodies of the men who had stayed behind. A mother would weep with joy at seeing her son alive, then weep again with a strange, unutterable confusion when he opened his bag to show the treasures he had brought home: precious tins of American corned beef, dense chocolate bars, small packets of real coffee, bars of soap. These food gifts, these life-saving offerings from the land of the enemy, were received with tearful, desperate gratitude, but they also underscored the vast, almost unbridgeable gulf that now separated them. He was the provider, the savior from across the ocean, but he was also a living, breathing reminder of a world of impossible plenty, a world that was utterly beyond the comprehension and reach of those who had endured the firestorm. The former prisoners struggled desperately to reintegrate into a society that was not just physically and economically bankrupt, but morally adrift. Their stories of American abundance, of daily meat and white bread, of ice cream and orange juice, were often met with sheer, disbelieving skepticism or, worse, with bitter resentment. It sounded like a fairy tale, a cruel and taunting fantasy. How could there be a land where meat was eaten every day, not saved for a once-a-year celebration? Where white bread was commonplace, not a rare luxury for the privileged? Where chocolate and coffee were not distant, fading memories but regular features of a meal? To the ears of people who were surviving on potato peels and sawdust-filled bread, it was a narrative that could not be true, and if it was an indictment of their own suffering. Many former POWs, sensing this hostility and disbelief, learned to keep the deepest truths of their American experience to themselves, understanding that their stories of humane treatment and full bellies did not fit, and could not comfort, the grim, starving reality of post-war Germany. But the lessons they had learned, the perspectives they had gained, did not simply disappear. They went underground, becoming a quiet internal guide, a hidden compass for the future. They had seen a different way of organizing a society, of relating to authority, of valuing the individual. They had experienced efficiency without brutal oppression, discipline without blind, fanatical obedience, and a prosperity that was, at least in theory, widely shared and not reserved for a privileged party elite, as they, along with millions of other Germans, participated in the monumental, back-breaking task of literally rebuilding their nation from the ashes. This lived experience became a powerful, if often unspoken, influence. The men who had been POWs in America would, in the coming years, become some of the most ardent and sincere supporters of the new democratic West Germany. They understood the practical value of the transatlantic partnership, of the Marshall Plan, because they had lived its premise. They had seen with their own eyes that the Americans were not the monstrous, subhuman foe of Nazi propaganda, but a people capable of great humanity, fairness, and generosity, even toward their former enemies. This first-hand knowledge made them crucial, if quiet, architects of reconciliation. This legacy extended beyond the political sphere and seeped into the very fabric of daily German society. The prolonged exposure to American food culture and its underlying ethos of abundance had a subtle but demonstrable impact on post-war German consumer habits and aspirations. After the currency reform of 1948 and the beginning of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, German dietary patterns began to gradually change, influenced in part by the returning POWs and the presence of American occupation forces. The consumption of white bread, once a symbol of American otherness, increased steadily. Ice cream parlors, modeled on American ones, became popular social spots. The American-style breakfast with fried eggs and bacon began to appear on German tables alongside the traditional cold cuts and cheeses. Packaged convenience foods, a concept born of American industrial food production, slowly found a market. It was a quiet, daily culinary integration, a testament to the profound power of a shared meal to bridge cultural divides and reshape desires, a legacy written not in political treaties, but in the evolving contents of the German pantry and the German stomach. For a significant number of former prisoners, the personal connection to America proved too powerful to sever. In the following decades, thousands of them applied for and were granted visas to immigrate back to the United States, returning to the country that had once been their prison as free men seeking a new life and a new future. They were drawn back by the memory of the landscape, the openness of the people, the sense of possibility and second chances they had encountered even behind the wire. Men like Oscar Wagner, who had been held at the camp in Eaton, Indiana, returned to live in that very town permanently, his personal history coming full circle in the most profound and poetic way imaginable. These men became living, breathing bridges between the two cultures, their personal life stories a powerful, human-scale repudiation of the very idea of eternal enmity. They were the ultimate proof that the American policy of humane treatment, of feeding the enemy, had not been a strategic mistake, but a profound long-term investment in peace and reconciliation. The camps themselves, meanwhile, were largely dismantled, erased from the American landscape, with an efficiency that mirrored their construction. The barracks were torn down for lumber or moved to become storage sheds on nearby farms. The barbed wire was coiled up and sold for scrap metal. The guard towers were dismantled. The land was returned to agriculture or left to revert to nature. Within a few years, very little physical evidence remained of the hundreds of facilities that had once housed over 370,000 German prisoners. The story of this strange, quiet chapter of the war began to fade from public memory, overshadowed by the grand narratives of D-Day, Iwo Jima, and the Holocaust, becoming a curious, half-forgotten footnote in the immense history of World War II. But the legacy of those camps, and the unprecedented quality and quantity of the food that was served in them, endures. It stands as a powerful, historical example of a nation choosing, at significant public relations cost, to follow international law and the principles of humane treatment, even when it was politically unpopular to do so. The American decision to feed its prisoners well was not just about technical compliance with the Geneva Convention. It was a statement of values, a declaration that even in the midst of a brutal, existential war, there was a line that a civilized nation would not cross, that basic human dignity would be respected, even in the face of the enemy. This policy, driven by a combination of legalism, pragmatism, and a fundamental sense of decency, undoubtedly saved countless lives and prevented the kind of deep, bitter resentment that can poison the peace for generations, creating a foundation upon which a new, democratic Germany could eventually be built. The story of the German POWs in America is, ultimately, a story about the transformative power of a simple, universal act, the act of sharing food. In the midst of history's most destructive and dehumanizing war, across the seemingly unbridgeable divides of ideology, nationalism, and violence, the simple, consistent act of providing a hungry person with a good, nutritious meal created a space for shared humanity to reassert itself. The shock of American abundance did more than just fill shrunken stomachs. It challenged deeply held prejudices, sowed powerful doubts, and planted the quiet, resilient seeds of future understanding and reconciliation. The German prisoners who arrived in America expecting a hell of brutality and starvation, and who found, instead, a full plate, carried that fundamental, life-altering lesson with them for the rest of their days. It was a lesson written not in the inflammatory language of propaganda leaflets or the soaring rhetoric of political speeches, but in the universal, undeniable language of roast beef and mashed potatoes, of white bread and butter, of apple pie and real coffee. A lesson that proved, in the most concrete way possible, that even between the bitterest of enemies, simple decency can, in the end, be a far more powerful and enduring weapon than hatred.